My name is Mike Willig. I'm a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and the Executive Director of the Institute of the Environment here at the University of Connecticut. Prior to coming to UConn in 2005, I held two positions at the National Science Foundation. I was a program officer in the Ecological Studies Cluster, and I was also the Division Director for Environmental Sciences. Before that, I was a professor at Texas Tech University for many years. In general, I'm a biodiversity scientist or a global change biologist, depending on your perspective. My research is ecological in nature. I try to quantify the abundance and distribution of species and understand the causes and consequences of their abundance and distribution. I've been really fortunate to have the opportunity to do that in a number of places throughout the New World, including tropical rainforests in Amazonia, tropical dry forests and woodland savannas in the Caatinga, Atlantic rainforest, the drylands of Chaco, as well as in temperate forests, rivers, and lakes. I've worked on a variety of groups of organisms representing different branches of the tree of life, including vertebrates, especially birds and bats, invertebrates, especially gastropods or snails, and insects, trees, bacteria, fungi, and viruses. I've enjoyed doing so on projects in the continental US, as well as in Brazil, Peru, Paraguay, and Puerto Rico. I should acknowledge that I've benefited in doing so because of 30 years of continuous funding from the National Science Foundation's long-term ecological research program to work in the Luquillo experimental forest of Puerto Rico. That critical support enabled me to study the responses of animal populations and communities to diverse climate-induced disturbances such as hurricanes, droughts, and global warming, and to do so in collaboration with large multidisciplinary teams of scholars from all over the world. So with that brief introduction, I'll ask Beverly to do the same.
Hello, everyone. I'm Beverly Penn. I'm so honored to have this opportunity to participate in the Seeing Truth Project. And I feel especially privileged to have this conversation with Mike Willig. As a scholar, scientist, and research, I've come to hugely respect him as we've interacted in preparation for this conversation. I'm an artist and a professor at Texas State University, where I've been teaching for over 30 years. Before teaching at Texas State, I was a Fulbright Fellow in the Program of Contemporary Metals at the Escuela Massana in Barcelona, Spain. I'm a bronze sculptor, and I'd like to share briefly my work with you. I make cast bronze installations using a somewhat maverick casting process I call the lost plant process. And I'm deeply invested in understanding our place in the natural world and in our stewardship of its remarkable treasures and mysteries. I'm especially inspired by the kingdom of plants with which we share this planet, particularly native species, invasive species, and other stoic upstarts that persist without our stewardship. To understand my subject matter more authentically and more knowledgeably, I've become a Texas master naturalist in the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve in Central Texas. My sculptural installations are created by harvesting live plants, often weeds, and casting them into small bronze specimens, and then soldering them together to make large-scale cohesive compositions. This creates an enduring stand-in for the ephemeral originals, much like a memorial. The notion of a memorial is significant in these times of climate change and extinction. Yet a memorial also links us to desire. We cherish what's memorialized. So in that way, a memorial can be also hopeful. Plants are the basis of all life forms. They give us everything we need to sustain life on Earth, including the very oxygen we breathe. As complex living organisms, they are a very essential part of life. Plants are the carbon sinks that allow us to reduce global warming and control drought and maintain our water supply. I've had the great privilege of being a professor in the School of Art and Design at Texas State University, where I direct the metals program. I have to confess, it was not my intention to be grounded in a single place for that long, but I've discovered a profound love of working with students in the medium I find most compelling. Another aspect of working within the academic context, as Michael mentioned, is the supportive environment it provides for research endeavors that might not necessarily be commercially viable outside of the university, but they are nonetheless vital, and they provide a context for a deeper understanding of how we can better see truth in a meaningful way. And to that end, I want to acknowledge the university, which has supported my creative endeavors for 9 major projects with faculty research grants for research all over the world, and has honored me with the esteemed Presidential Seminar Award for Research. This research support has fostered further support in the form of grants and fellowships from the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Lux Art Institute, Connemara Conservancy, and the Texas Commission on the Arts. I'm also proud to have been named the 2017 Texas State 3D Artist, awarded by the Texas Commission on the Arts. I'm also sincerely grateful that my sculptures can be shared with wider audiences as a part of museum collections, including the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Cooper Hewitt, that's the Smithsonian's Design Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Yale University Art Gallery. I would lastly like to mention my fork in the road. I make public art that parallels my studio practice, and these two are vastly different practices, but they rely on the same conceptual underpinnings to encourage a focused observation of our interaction with the natural world. The public art installations are both indoors and in vast outdoor spaces, and they allow access to people for art outside of the sanctioned museum spaces that become places of reflection that are integrated rather than separated from daily life. The installation, Global Proportion, activates an outdoor public plaza in San Diego at the Carte Hotel. And it's both a journey and a destination. It's created from individual bronze leaves that are cast from live flora at Balboa Park. The outdoor garden space at the Whole Foods Landmark headquarters in Austin integrates cast bronze sculptures created from plants that are useful beyond ornamentation, either medicinally or nutritionally. And the cities of Austin, El Paso, San Marcos, and Las Cruces are all cities where I'm able to share my passion and concern for the botanical world around us, with the goal of offering opportunities to reflect on seeing truth in the immediate world around us.
Thanks, Beverly, for that really informative overview, and also for sharing a preprint of your upcoming book, Foregrounding. I thought the book was beautiful, inspiring, and really informative, and of course it catalyzed a number of questions that will form the basis of the things that we'll be chatting about shortly. So thank you for sharing that. So as I mentioned, you chose the word foregrounding as the title of your book, and truthfully, I've used the word many times as a noun, the foreground, but I've never seen it used as a verb. So I wondered of the title's relevance to seeing the truth, and wondered if you could chat a bit about how you came to choose the title and how you see its relationship to the nature of truth.
You know, one of the really cherished outcomes of making a book there, which is a hugely integrated process with a lot of people involved, but my association with the brilliant writers and scholars has been so rewarding. One of whom is Catherine Moore, who is also a professor at the University of Connecticut, and curator Suzanne Ramayak for the essays they've written. And again, it's a wonderful opportunity to have people of that caliber reflect on work. And in point of fact, I was introduced to the idea, the verb foregrounding, by Suzanne Ramayak. And it comes from a linguistic term, actually, which means to make something ultra conspicuous. And to turn the reader's attention away from the immediate subject matter into focus on not the object that's being portrayed, but the content that the subject matter being transformed through materials, through color, through shape and texture, give to the audience. So there's a distinct difference in a work of art between the subject matter and the content that it's portraying. And so linguistically, again, as I mentioned, foregrounding, it makes something strange by defamiliarizing the familiar. So it helps the viewer, or in the case of linguistically, the reader, to make the shift from what is said to how it's said and what it actually means. So in my own work, I try to create a similar stylistic emphasis to shift the viewer's perception from what is being shown to how it's being shown. In the sculpture Twin, for example, I count on the authority that bronze has in the history of art to transform what were live plants into a sculpture. And with that material transformation, familiar live plants become defamiliarized in that they cease to be ephemeral entities that live and die. And they instead become a permanent memorial that comments on both the relationship that these two invasive plants, thistle and hydrilla, have to each other. And it also comments on the significant role that plants have in the revelation of larger truths about our relationship to nature. And by reconfiguring the familiar organic growth patterns of these two individual plants into an aesthetic replacement, as it were, of intertwined patterns and movements, and I should say nowhere seen in the natural world, there's a further defamiliarization that provokes us as viewers to rethink the connections that these two unlike life forms have to each other. And by taming familiar, wild, kind of unfettered natural plant growth into unfamiliar, hypnotic, kind of writhing aesthetic configurations, there's also the potential for us to reassess our notions about beauty and significance. Also, by plucking a live plant from a familiar outdoor environment and then reconfiguring it on an interior wall vertically, rather than in a familiar horizontal configuration, making it seem to grow in an unfamiliar, but also somehow believable way that's perpendicular to the force of gravity, viewers have the opportunity to reflect on these vertical landscapes and potentially question some of the truths that they had previously come to believe are immutable. So through foregrounding, art has the potential to reveal larger truths through its fiction and through its imaginative potential. So making the usual unusual increases attention and awareness and provides the opportunity to re-examine our preconceived belief systems based on convention or habit in the quest for seeing truth. Science and ecology do seek truths using data and analysis, though, Michael, and I'm interested in knowing what you see are the essential similarities and differences between your objective techniques and my subjective methodologies.
Well, as you're probably aware, Beverly, early on as students of ecology or students of biology, we're taught that the first step in the scientific method is to, quote unquote, make observations, literally to see nature. And from that seeing, we should pose questions and hypotheses about the generality of the patterns or the mechanisms that give rise to them. Of course, sometimes the seeing is secondhand. It's really derived from the direct observations of others as amassed in the literature and publications. And this constraint's particularly challenging for new initiates to science, like undergraduate students and graduate students, where either the extent of what they've seen is rather narrow. That is, for example, they may want to conduct research in the tropics, but they've never been there. Or the lens that they use to facilitate seeing is not dynamic, the proverbial seeing the forest, but not the trees, or seeing the trees, but not the forest. But science in general, and I think ecology in particular, constantly re-examine the extent of our understanding by encouraging replication, replication of observations, replication of experiments, and as well as by posing the same question in different contexts that might relate to habitats, organisms, or even time periods. This promotes to some extent a discrimination between what's general and what's specific. And by specific, I mean restricted in time or space or organism. Moreover, sometimes a particular outcome for a particular study is consistent with a variety of interpretations. And good science attempts to identify competing hypotheses and craft clever experiments to distinguish among them. I think another really important aspect of science is that it's always conducted within the context of theory. Theory is critical. Theory represents the intellectual infrastructure that reflects our current understanding. It's a kind of overarching organizational platform that assembles information, data, confirmed generalizations, concepts, models, and hypotheses, and guides future research. Of course, this facilitates rapid progress, but there's also a danger. That is, if we follow current theory blindly, it can predispose us to see certain things in certain ways, or to ask certain questions as they relate to the current body of knowledge. Importantly, good science is always skeptical and always explores observations from new perspectives, recognizing that we hopefully get closer to the truth by continually challenging what we think we know. To my thinking, to best see the truth, we should constantly be adjusting our lenses, foregrounding and actually backgrounding our observations. We should be exploring unseen connections and unseen associations as we move into the future. Yeah, it's very interesting that the concepts of focal depth come into play, but also in a lot of ways, your explanation reminded me of in ecology, we do manipulative experiments where you can transplant species or manipulate abundances and diversity and see what the outcomes are. So in a lot of ways, you're in a poetic or artistic kind of way, you're similarly doing these manipulative experiments to reveal aspects of truth that you can't kind of see from other perspectives. And I found that very, very interesting, very cool.
Mm.
So also your sculptures bring to the forefront many aspects of the tree of life. And by tree of life, I'm talking from an evolutionary perspective. Its representation is a vision of the speciation process that documents ancestral relationships among species and that leads to the diversity of forms and functions that characterize contemporary life. And from an ecological perspective, trees and plants in general, as you mentioned, transform energy from the sun and become the food that supports all the other organisms on the planet, including humans. And in addition, plants are habitats and landscapes on which a multitude of other species interact. So could you comment a little bit more in more detail about how these perspectives about the tree of life inform your work or provide a reflection of truth in nature?
Again, I'm inspired by one of the writers in the foregrounding book, who talks about the idea of plant blindness, that as humans, we are often see lush and rich landscapes as kind of background wallpaper because we are geared to be looking for danger and survival. But in truth, plants are the sustain all of life. As I said, and as you mentioned, clearly, the very oxygen that we breathe. They're the carbon sinks that are going to help us to solve issues related to global warming. And from that place that sustains all of life, I think it's critical that we have not only the science, which is so incredibly important, but also we understand the tree of life and the source from which all things come from a point from imagination, from the context that will help us envision the things that we can't see. A lot of the pieces in my Weeds series are imagined networks that are invisible, that we might except for newer technologies, that to see, for example, an underground root system as the roots of trees communicate with each other, or the network of mycelium that connects all living things together, that as an organism is one of the largest things on our planet. But to see that, one must destroy the environment or uncover the environment that the networks exist in. So I think it's with the facts and the information and the wealth of knowledge from science, artists can take that information and through the lens of imagination, be able to potentially recreate that for a viewer to have a larger context. And in terms of the ability to be able to reflect on things we can't see, to show the connections between things, and as you mentioned, the tree of life is the beginning or a structure on which we hang a lot of information, both imagined and factual, that help us as humans to understand our part and our place in this, and that I think in very, very profound ways shows our interconnectedness to this larger system that we are not separate from. In fact, we're not, although we're often claimed to be at the top of the food chain, quite frankly, that is a precarious balance point because we are certainly dependent and interrelated to all the other things in that tree of life that provide for our existence. Well, Michael, it's tempting to think about both time and place only in terms of what's quantifiable and measurable. And in science and ecology, I'm sure that specificity correlates with accuracy, the objective truth, for example. So recording place and time seems an essential aspect of data collection and analysis. However, for me, both time and place are more accurately represented qualitatively. In science, it seems that extrapolation is required for seeing truth. So I'm interested in your ideas about how a deep understanding, for example, of a single study can relate to the seeing of larger truths. I'm thinking about how your research, say, of bats or snails has the potential to predict broader ecological changes and predictions.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's in some senses, it's a return to the issue of generality versus specificity and the trade-offs between a deep exploration of place-specific or taxon-specific understanding, sometimes referred to as natural history, versus more comparative explorations that involve many species or many places. And we have to remember that there are millions of species. Many are unknown to science. Similarly, there are many places, millions, if one considers that a place for a microbe could be a cubic centimeter of soil, whereas for a migratory bat, it could involve thousands of kilometers between southern Mexico and parts of the US Southwest, or over 4,000 meters of elevation from sea level to the peaks of the Andes. Site-specific or taxon-specific studies enhance understanding about the details of connections that structure nature. The connections can be biotic, involving living organisms, and therefore species interactions that are reflected in sociality or interactions between males and females or between parents and offspring, or could even be interspecific in nature, involve multiple species. So aspects of competition, predation, or mutualisms come into play. Or the connections can be abiotic, involving the non-living world, or organisms interact with aspects such as water, nutrients, soil, characteristics, temperature, and precipitation. And these associations together define the ecological niches of species and can be reflective of the complexities of nature, but perhaps not its generality. Generalities often arise when studies involve multiple species at the same site, or single species or groups of species at multiple sites. These kinds of studies can be challenging from a logistical perspective or a financial perspective, but they complement the site-specific and taxon-specific study. It seems to me that our understanding, especially our ecological understanding, best advances when both complementary approaches or ways of seeing are undertaken in a synthetic context that leads to predictive understanding, and as a consequence, a reduction in the uncertainty of what we think the future may hold. As you know, much of what we know about biodiversity in the tree of life it derives from paleontological studies of extinct forms that have been preserved via taphonomic or fossilization processes. Uh, Nonetheless, the fossilization process itself uh, is selective, and it only incompletely reveals the details of life that existed eons ago. Your artistic process of creating bronze sculptures is very analogous, it seems to me, to this fossilization process. And like it allows us to gain glimpses of truths about life that we might be unaware of or unappreciative of. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit in more detail about the process of forming your sculptures. I find it really fascinating, and the analogy to fossilization makes it even more interesting in that the process whereby you create the sculpture sort of reifies the lesson or the image of the truth that you're conveying.
That's a really rich analogy. Thank you for leading us in that direction, because yes, making something ephemeral permanent through the process of fossilization is, as you mentioned, somewhat selective. Not everything gets fossilized, for sure. But it's a really interesting transformation process whereby through various consequences, nature preserves what was before over a long period of time. And I'm also interested in my own work of taking those ephemeral things and using, through the medium of bronze, through the medium and the authority of bronze, making those things permanent. I think one aspect that I'd like to insert into the conversation is that in the situation, first of all, there's a temporal difference for sure. My process of turning plants definitely into something permanent is immediate. It doesn't take centuries to accomplish. And unlike fossilization, which actually transforms a thing into a more permanent version of itself, the process of casting plants into bronze is really, there's the additional aspect of the bronze being a replacement of the plant. So I have to destroy the actual thing in a process. In a kiln, I put the live plants into what's called an investment, put them in the kiln, and as the plant burns out, it leaves a negative space that's the exact replica of the thing that was. And to make a long story short, then replace that negative space with liquid bronze that then becomes permanent. So that interests me, into that idea of replacement rather than transformation is a nuance that I think is important, because one thing has to leave, to be destroyed, in order for another thing to exist. And for me, that becomes then a memorial. So we have the idea of absence and presence. That is very important in the practice of sculpture, because shadows and light are a very important part of my work as well. That the negative space between the assembled bronzes becomes activated by the world or the environment that it exists in. The pieces are very different depending on what the light source is, and whether you're close to them or far away from them. So our observation skills are challenged in a number of different kinds of ways in terms of having this replacement of something that existed. So while you're simultaneously looking at a piece and reflecting on what it means, there's always the presence in our memories and in our minds of the thing that we're familiar with in the real world. So for example, in the thistles, while they are aesthetic objects, for example, on a wall, one also has in the back of one's mind the memory of having potentially been in a patch of thistles and having that real life entity around them, and potentially being harmed in some way by them, because they're tricky things to harvest, I can assure you. And that I think it's quite possible that people are thinking on two different parallel levels when one's looking at a work of art, a bronze sculpture, but also what it reminds them of in their everyday experiences.
That's very interesting. I think that it's both similar and different, as we find many things are. Uh, and 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 you've already mentioned some of this, but I think, your sculptures and your exposition here sort of highlight some of the recurrent themes that are part of the focus of the discipline of ecology, that the one that I focus on. And so I just wondered if you could comment a little more on a couple of themes that I work on as an ecologist that you actually incorporate into the background that gives rise to the sculpture or to your interpretation of them. And that is sort of the sense of place, the sense of time, and the sense of interactions. Ecologists study particular places at particular times, or look at variation among places or variation over time to try to understand the structure and function of nature. And you kind of do similar things in your work. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of hear your thoughts on that.
I love that sort of your equation to the temporal aspect of work, as you mentioned previously in fossilization, but also this idea of how scientists really, in their specificity, are really signaling something that's happening certain place and certain times. And I have this couple of wonderful experiences working with, for example, the Moody Foundation. I worked with a botanist at that foundation, and I went to the Moody Gardens and collected cast native plants, and then cast them into bronze and assembled them into a sculptural format that now is in the interior spaces of the foundation. So it was like a sculptural snapshot, really, that froze a place and time for posterity. So it's a signature of that place. And although the sculpture now, as a bronze configuration, is eternal, it did represent the moment at which I gathered those plants. And so in my work also, I feel I am not a botanist, but I feel deeply allied to that field because, like botanists, I harvest plants for studying, and I think that once I cast them into bronze, they're frozen in that moment. And it's not only the plant is sacrificed, but it also then the bronze replacement honors that place where they grew. And these are humble places, I should say. And I think potentially in your field, it's not the places of authority that you study. It likely is the small, potentially humble places that have potentially the most biodiversity. So as I collect, for example, invasive species or the weedy species like thistles by the side of the highway, because that's where they enjoy growing the most in disturbed environments. That's a really humble place of origin, but yet, for me, I think it's a kind of a magical tribute to the journeys that we make up and down that highway every day. So again, it's this idea of choosing a place and time is in some ways coincidental, but it's also sometimes determined by species growth. I once did a series called Marking Time and Plotting Place. And I wanted that project to focus on a certain ecological perspective. So between the vernal equinox and summer solstice, I collected botanical samples within a predefined place. And these specimens of time and place were cast into bronze. And so they ceased being like specific foliage samples. So between the vernal equinox and the summer solstice, I collected botanical samples within a predefined place. These specimens of time and place were then cast into bronze. And what's important to me about that, it changed their meaning from the specific foliage samples that they were to the more general representations of ideas of flora in space and time, as I described before. The analogy I like to think about is the difference between, for example, a specific live apple, which we relate to in terms of species, flavor, color, culinary advantages, the amount of time it takes to rot, the wormholes it has, all of those things. And then I think about a bronze replacement for that, referring to something that I think of as appledom, right? Which refers to metaphors like the Garden of Eden, forbidden fruit, Adam's apple, apple pie, Johnny Appleseed, comparing apples to oranges. So that larger context of what the meaning of an apple is for us, the metaphors that it evokes. And then in that marking time, plotting place project, this was the first attempt that I had reconfigured these plants together according to narratives that create this snapshot of a particular place at a particular time. And that brought forward ideas about taxonomy and cross-pollination, grafting, hybridization, and the other really interesting and profound ways that science then finds relationships between different species. And in some ways, this relates again back to the tree of life, because the notion of a genetic lineage, helps us understand sources, and also in terms of gives us a sense of both past, present, and future.
That was interesting, and I particularly enjoyed the phenological representations of the stages of life, so to speak, of particular plants, and also your recollection of in a sense we are the sum of our interactions with the rest of life over time. And you've captured, again, everything we capture in life is a snapshot, but it's a snapshot of that very dynamic process, which I think you did quite effectively in those sculptural representations. So that's, to me, that's very cool. So thank you for sharing that with us. I thought it would also be useful if you could maybe expand a little bit on sort of how your art reflects the interactions among plants, or how it reflects the interactions of plants with humans. I think it informs sometimes, I think, the compositions of your work, but also kind of reflects on the truths that you see in nature, or that you see and you like to communicate via your art.
Taking plant forms from the outside with the intention of making them permanent into bronze and then bringing them into interior spaces, I think changes the relationship that we normally have with the world of flora around us. That we impose, in many ways, always, a structure on the natural world in our sort of fierce impulse to try to control it. We both admire nature, but we also want to be sure that we have some means of bringing it within the realm of our control. And my strategy of assembling cast bronze plant parts into structures that rely in many ways on geometry, circles, spheres, squares, is a reflection on that hierarchy we feel when we're in relationship to nature, as if we are able to have some, and we do have a really large control over our environment, which is potentially the source of many of the problems we find ourselves in right now. But the idea of bringing it through art, a context by which we see these botanicals tightly controlled through pattern, through repetition, again, and through geometry, is important. The idea of a matrix or web of individual bronze leaves and branches and blooms as geometric shapes certainly is not found normally in the natural world. But it's important to remember that primary geometric forms like the sphere and the cube and the pyramids are structural building blocks for the physical world. And I'm interested in how that relates cognitively, because there's great research, especially in Montessori training, that equates the haptic experience of geometric forms, understanding their shape and knowing them at a very early age, again, is an important basis of cognitive development. And then a further analogy for me is that plants are the essential building blocks for a sustainable future, as we've come to realize. I'm also interested in aspects of science, for example, the science of biomimicry, which analyzes nature's best ideas and then imitates the designs to help solve human problems. So, for example, scientists study a leaf to invent a better solar cell. Janine Banyas has written extensively on this. And also, for example, analyzing how spiders manufacture the fiber, waterproof fiber, that's 5 times stronger than steel. These are really interesting examples of how these maverick researchers envision sustainability. So I think that by combining plants, which are the basis of a sustainable future, into geometric forms, is an interesting way of being able to comment on the essential nature of both things. You know, I think it would be meaningful and revealing to think about your question about the interaction among plants and the interaction between plants and humans from a scientist's perspective. As global warming accelerates change, how do ecologists and scientists reckon with the somewhat traumatic understanding and the tragic knowledge that the things they research and devote their life's work to may be gone before they are?
Wow, that's a particularly poignant question for scientists and people everywhere, and especially for the current generation of students and young people. And to me, it can be translated to some extent into how can we maintain hope? And so I think your historical summary about concepts of nature reminds me that when we see nature as something that excludes humans, it creates a false dichotomy. Humans have been and always will be a part of nature in some ways, just like every other species that consume resources, establishes territory, or engages in interactions with other species. 2 things are noteworthy, however, about humans, especially in the Anthropocene. First, they are keystone species, and our effects are disproportionately large given our numbers. And we're also consummate ecological engineers, capable of totally altering the living and non-living components of the planet, and doing so at a pace and spatial extent never before experienced by living organisms. The magnitude of change created by humans is expansive from a spatial perspective and unprecedentedly rapid from a temporal perspective. This means that many species may not be able to adapt to anthropogenic change and may in fact go extinct, leading to a moral issue as well as a practical issue. Second, we're a species that can project the outcome of our actions and incorporate values, morals, to guide those actions to facilitate particular outcomes. This is the hope of the future. This is the essence of considerations that should inform sustainable and desirable futures. And these considerations should involve multiple perspectives, disciplines that see things differently, and also engage multiple stakeholders and constituencies who differentially benefit or suffer from the outcomes of our decisions. I think that the sense of potential loss or likely loss are, as you say, both traumatic and tragic. I think that the knowledge of that future fires the passion of environmentalists and conservationists alike. And it's especially overwhelming, I think, for young people. At the same time, I think it has made many of us question from a moral perspective whether or how we should engage with our values, especially when we operate as scientists within the context of society at large. Well, I loved your earlier comment about thistles and the humble settings within which you find them and how they sort of motivated your work. And it reminded me, in fact, of some early work in my field, ecology, by a scientist named Otto Sulbrig, who studied one of the most foundational questions in ecology, which had to do with strategies that allow species to coexist with each other. And his focus was on the dandelion, and his setting was in a backyard. And so from these humble beginnings, we gain great insights into the nature of truth and the world that we live around. So that also reminded me that, you do have in your work a focus on weeds or weedy species. And at least I drew from the work that you've done that you're in fact are inspired to some extent by weeds and find them fascinating. So I wonder if you might comment on that.
Interestingly, I'm most interested in how we've come to see things as weeds, because the things we think about weeds aren't always necessarily invasive species. They just thrive in disturbed environments. And as I've mentioned, what our human relationship, because in fact, weed is not a biological term; it's a linguistic one, and have been accused in some ways or branded as being a champion of weeds, when in fact I'm. I take their existence seriously in terms of understanding why we've come to think of them in the way. I think for me, because weeds are so prolific, and since I use so many plant parts in my work, I try to take advantage of opportunities where nature's prolific. Weeds are certainly generous. I've been fascinated by the work of Michael Pollan, who writes extensively about botany, that he says a weed is any plant in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Emerson once said that a weed is simply a plant whose virtues we haven't yet discovered. Even though truly weeds may, in some circumstances, be a bane to ecosystems, they're constantly reinventing themselves. And I think that within that context, it's worth examining what our relationship is to these maligned plants. And I think that also our relationship to weeds takes into consideration that we are in some ways competing with them for open places over many millennium, for things we want, for crops, for other vegetation that we find that are sustenance for human existence. I'll go back to talking about my sculpture twin that I showed earlier, which is it's kind of snares a writhing circle of the San Marcos River's invasive hydrilla within a confining block of thistle that I got from the riverbank. So they, both of those plants are invasive, and they are a challenge to both the plants around them and the human intentions for these spaces that they dominate. But ironically, they're not threats to each other. They are rather kind of parallel allies in their efforts to survive. And again, etymologically, weeds are, it emerged as a concept, not a definition. And it became embedded and expressed through language. And again, this idea of that we're contending for places in the natural world with these weeds has me thinking about them in more detail. I think that we potentially, in terms of like seeing our true relationship or seeing the truth of our relationship, we might better accept, instead of having an either or dichotomy to our thinking process, potentially that we would think about an either and as a more nuanced way of thinking about our relationship to the natural world, and especially in this case, to weeds?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting that on the one hand, humans devote a lot of time and energy to eradicating weeds purposefully and probably serendipitously because of, as you mentioned earlier, constructing roads and otherwise altering landscapes. We also invite weeds into our backyard, so to speak. So it's a love-hate relationship. So I want to change directions a little bit maybe and ask a question that in my mind distinguishes or at least provides a contrast between science and art in the broadest of senses. And as a scientist, we're often taught or encouraged at least to sort of divorce value from our research. Science tells us how the world works. It's a description of fact in a sense, or it tells us how the world could look based upon how it currently looks. So it's a kind of prediction. And yet in a lot of ways, humanities and arts actively, passionately embrace certain values and perhaps equally passionately and actively fail to embrace other kinds of values. And so, and as a consequence, I think that this liberation to imagine is really one of the real big strengths of non-science in understanding truth or understanding how the world works. So, you're both a prolific and a well-respected artist, so I wondered if you could comment on that perception, false or true, about the difference between sort of art and science.
As I think you alluded to as well, they not only are quite different in that way, they bear some strong and interwoven connections. And I think that art that is most successful, while it may be grounded in a value system, is not in fact potentially an answer in terms of data, but really poses profound questions for viewers. So in that way, while there is potentially a point of departure for an artist to begin working, the idea is to potentially open up the larger subject matter and the larger content for viewers to potentially insert their own value systems. And this may diverge slightly from what you were asking, but I'm very interested in how, for example, scientific discoveries also shape the larger world of the humanities. And I'm thinking about, I'll express that through how I know that the art world has changed, for example, in the last 100 years. Because at the beginning of the 20th century, ornament was associated with skill and quality. But then within a decade, the 20th century, the modernist architect Adolf Loos wrote his famous essay, Ornament and Crime. And in it, he claimed that ornament can have the effect of causing objects to go out of style and thus become obsolete. And he concluded that this was a shameful waste of human energy for all of the craftsmen and artists who were putting great detail and effort and time into their work. So this coincided actually with the mid-20th century modernist movement, because science at that point was moving forward clearly and objectively. And the focus of science was looking at organic growth and nature's biotechnical constructions. And for the most part, this reexamination of nature occurred through visualizing technology. So science was really, really informing a lot of the way we think about things. And the visualizing technologies such as photography and the telescope and the microscope changed our entire relationship to nature. And so we were suddenly not looking at the ornamental values of nature, but we were looking at the structural recognition of nature's design and appearance. And so to reach back to your earlier question about value, I think in that point, art and science were sort of trying to be more objective and to divorce value from the expressive potential of form in the modernist movement, for example. But then I'm also interested in most recent changes which emerged with developing digital technologies. So for example, in today's world, patterns are moving, and ornament is now being postulated as a kind of emerging phenomenon, in fact, as an excess of algorithmic patterns, like, for example, cellular automaton and other computer-generated mathematical functions that model processes in nature, such as growth patterns in plants and the patterning of seashells. And so in science, in mathematics, and in microstructure modeling, a cellular automaton predicts a regular grid of cells, each with the same rule for updating. And so each time the rules are applied to the whole grid, a new generation of cells is created. And the result over time is a lush textural graphic ornamentation, which is also capable of a wide variety of colors and designs. And so there's a proliferation of pattern and ornament with nature as the fundamental model. And so back to your question about value, I think that I'm personally guided by theories of patterning in nature, and both in how it appears to us and about the organization it has. But I'm wondering if we're ever, even as scientists, ever able to completely divorce ourselves away from having a value system that helps us organize structures that either increases, emphasizes, or exaggerates an idea or purpose. Because I think both in art and science, we have the impulse to arrange the kind of the wild variety of the natural world to fit our intellectual symmetry. I think it's a fundamental human urge that's present, again, in both science and art. And so I'm interested in speaking to the power of that desire rather than placing a value system on it. But I'm fascinated by, in both art and science, the contradicting needs to both idealize and revere nature for what it is, but also to modify it. And I'm wondering, for example, in science, that when you collect data as an ecologist, being in the presence of the very thing that you're studying, do you feel like you change or influences the outcome simply by being there? Like, even if you're outside of a strictly interpretive value system, can you objectively see truth?
Now, this is probably a major question in all of science, but of ecology in particular. I guess I'm a product of my time, so it's also, as a reference, it's embodied in Star Trek, where the prime directive is for personnel to avoid any interference or to reduce their impact on the very things that they're studying and investigating. So in science in general, and in ecology in particular, a behavioral ecologist asks herself, by virtue of my presence, visual presence, auditory presence, even olfactory presence, what other organisms see, hear, or smell, do we alter the behavior of that species? So is our perception of the truth influenced by our desire to learn it, and therefore a biased impression of what goes on? Or a community ecologist like myself, I might be studying long-term changes in the species composition of a forest, and yet my presence in that forest, my going into the woods and hiking to my site and in counting or observing organisms in nature, I will have compacted the soil somewhat by my footsteps and trampled some of the vegetation, no matter how careful I am. And so ecological studies are increasingly asking, to what extent does the observer influence that which is observed? And I think the hope is always that in recognizing that this happens, we develop sort of field protocols that minimize the likelihood that we were to do that, or at least that we explicitly recognize that what we see may in fact have been influenced by our presence. And for me, as a long-term scientist who studies long-term ecological processes, it becomes even more important because there are very few sites throughout the world that are dedicated to long-term ecological research, which I happen to think is some of the most important research that we do. Because before I can understand the plot or the denouement of a movie, I need to watch the whole movie. And yet, if we only study a particular site for a year or 2 years or 5 years, we're trying to make all of those extrapolations without any real knowledge of what transpired during the movie. So more and more scientists are taking this long-term perspective to understand the dynamics of plants, animals, and microbes in nature. And yet, because there's so few of these sites, more and more people are drawn to them to do their studies there for two purposes. They're protected from development so that that site will exist over the long term. And there's a lot of other knowledge that's known that can help explain or interpret the results that they get. And so we have an increasing density of people studying long-term sites so that the potential exists for a multitude of people now to start influencing the outcome of research by their joint presence in these long-term study sites. So for example, at the site that I work at in Puerto Rico, we actually have a committee. And the committee, anytime someone wants to come work on our long-term plots, they have to say, what's the question I'm asking? Why do I need to answer that in these plots? And why can't this research be done elsewhere? Because we want to try to minimize, not eliminate, because we'll never eliminate it, but how can we minimize the impact of other people's studies on ongoing studies that have been there for 20 or 30 years and that will persist in the long term? So I think this is as humans modify the planet more and more over time, there's going to be fewer and fewer long-term study sites. So this question that at first blush may sound trivial is actually quite profound. And I think one that we need to be cognizant of in everything that we do. So I think that was an interesting observation on your part. And of course, the other aspect of it is that remote sensing technologies now allow us to make recordings of visual recordings, auditory recordings, so that we actually need not be in nature to observe nature anymore. And that's a wonderful tool to some extent, and it certainly reduces the likelihood of unintended disruption of the natural interactions that we're studying. But it's also kind of sad because one of the things that really motivates me, at least, is this fascination with what I see and how I may go into the field to see A, but when I'm focusing on A, I also see B, C, D, and E. And if I'm not there in person to appreciate that variation, or if I don't use the title of your book, foregrounding, if I don't focus in and out on everything that I'm looking at, I'm going to miss something that will help me interpret in the longer term progression of changes that I'm looking at. Well, as I think you may know, Beverly, I spent over 2 decades of my career in Texas and taught a field course at the Junction Field Station in the hill country of Central Texas, very close to your domain. 2 main groups of students were enrolled in those courses, biologists and artists, much like you and me. And I have a couple of observations about those interactions. Both groups of students and the faculty that taught the courses were incredibly impassionate about their interests and the coursework that they were pursuing. It was clear that their activities inspired each other, and that although each saw nature in different ways, they often saw nature in complementary manners. Perhaps more importantly, this setting and organization prompted multidisciplinarity and even transdisciplinarity. It facilitated a greater understanding of the pursuits of art and science and allowed each group to see scientists and artists as people, striving, however imperfectly, to understand a very complex world. Do you think that such experiences are important for enhancing our abilities to see truth and to recognize different ways of knowing? And if sufficient opportunities of this kind exist based upon your experiences over the past decades?
Well, thank you for that thoughtful question. And coincidentally, I've had the great fortune to have attended a conference at that same Junction field station that you taught at for many years. And I do recognize its beauty and its potential for inspiring collaboration between what are seemingly different disciplines. But the relationship between art and science in their quest for seeing truth through different lenses, that's been acknowledged by both artists and scientists for many centuries, although it is a changing definition over the centuries. To my way of thinking, art interprets the visual world through illusion and imagination, and science mines the unseen, or as yet unobserved phenomenon that defines the world's workings. I like to think about the differences between art and sciences, the differences and the similarities, using the metaphor of a funnel. Again, to my way of thinking, art finds itself at the narrow end of the funnel. And in its quest to elaborate on an essential kernel of truth in order to broaden the singular context to reveal larger, more expansive truths. On the other hand, science, I am observing, finds itself at the large end of the funnel with the enormity and the complexity of the full world in full view. And science is challenged with the task of establishing a single point of focused objectivity within that larger view, whose truth is quantifiable. And because the funnel is a shared methodology, I mean, in spite of its inverse strategy for each field, artists and scientists, from my way of thinking, are more allies than opposites. You know, the enormity of information currently at our fingertips encourage specificity and division between the disciplines as we skill ourselves in the knowledge base of our respective fields before we even have the opportunity to embark sometimes on the creative aspect. But as you mentioned, Michael, multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary opportunities, they offer us a possibility to learn the value of each other's way of knowing. Also, as you mentioned, there are so many ways of knowing, and by extension, so many ways of seeing truth. When making my own work, I try to respond as honestly as I can to the shape, the texture, the density of the forms while I build my sculptures. And though for my research, I actively research botany, my mind is generally clear of everything except my direct response to the evolving sculpture as I work. In fact, I really try not to have a formal outcome in mind as I build work. I see my process of creativity the way Robert Irwin discusses how an artist learns to see, which is that art is the act of making something where you forget the name of what you're seeing, bypassing language, so to speak. Artists and scientists have many things in common. I think especially in terms of quest and discovery. I have such gratitude for the scientific community, and especially for the work of ecologists like yourself, whose research is at the forefront of caring for this planet. Art can add context, though, to scientific facts. So in my practice, I've come to understand that what we cannot see, we imagine. And then what we imagine, in fact, then changes what we see. So art provokes a shift in perception, which has the power to clarify the complexities we live with, while also invigorating our curiosity to learn more about the world we inhabit. So I find your question compelling on many levels, not only from the perspective of how the specializations of art and science both confound and inspire each other, but also from the standpoint that each have their respective knowledge bases. And yet, from what I'm learning about your work as a biodiversity scientist and global change biologist, you're in a rare position in the sciences. Your research seems at once specific and abstract in terms of data collection and theory, but also by necessity encompassing and broadly relevant in terms of application, or should we say in terms of life as we know it?
I think that we live in an age of specialization, both in terms of the workforce and in terms of the university. And I fear we don't grow to appreciate the different or similar questions asked by biophysical scientists and artists, or social scientists and humanists, or that we don't really understand fully the different or similar perspectives and lenses used by those groups of scholars, both in terms of posing questions, addressing issues, or answering the same or similar questions. I think this does really relate back again to the complementarity of ways of knowing. And I would guess that most of us don't fully understand the differences and similarities among disciplines that relate to ways of knowing. And addressing this may actually require a restructuring of some of the ways that universities and faculties are organized. Finally, like you, I'm really inspired and awed by the beauty of nature. Its simultaneous simplicity and complexity, its diversity and its adaptability. And in an unconscious or semi-conscious way, this beauty motivates me to study nature and rewards me for having done so. Clearly, Beverly, I think we both appreciate that personal interactions matter. So I think it's appropriate to conclude on a more personal note about you as an artist and me as a scientist. And that is to explore what are the most rewarding aspects of our work, both from the perspective of our personal development or growth, but also from the perspective of how our actions influence others. For example, prior to working on my dissertation, I spent my entire life within a couple of 100 miles of my hometown, which was Pittsburgh. This encouraged a kind of myopia that was not uncommon for the lower middle class or for first-generation students in the 60s and the 70s. My dissertation research disrupted that comfort, quote unquote, comfort of the familiar in a multitude of ways. I found myself living in northeastern Brazil for almost 2 years. In northeastern Brazil, the flora and fauna, the culture, the language, the conventions, the politics, they were all alien to me. It was very disruptive. It was an area without phone, television, or even a newspaper. Nonetheless, it really opened my eyes to different ways of being. It challenged me to be self-reliant and maybe even innovative in ways that I could not have imagined had I not left the familiarity of my home in Pennsylvania. Northeastern Brazil is also a tremendously poor area. I would interact with people living in a 100-square-foot hut without electricity, water, or even sanitation of any type. Their possessions were meager, but they were some of the most generous people that I have ever met in my whole life. I always remember a particular time when my field assistant and I had hiked up a mountain to a site where I would be collecting bats in that evening. And along the way, we encountered an old couple living in a hut that literally comprised tree branches and mud for walls and palm fronds for a roof. The couple offered me some water. Northeastern Brazil is incredibly hot. It was probably over 90 degrees Fahrenheit that day. And the water came in a metal pitcher that was only cooled by its protection from the sun in the shaded area of the hut. You know, the water actually really hit the spot, but it didn't seem particularly remarkable to me. And at first blush, I considered the couple's actions to be a nice gesture. But after hiking for a bit, the field assistant let me know that this old couple had probably walked along a dirt path wearing flip-flops for over 4 hours round trip to obtain maybe 10 gallons of water. Their generosity to me, a complete stranger, was so underappreciated by me at first. This kind of generosity on their part involved substantive hardship, and it was remarkable. The data or information or facts about the exchange of water was the same before and after my field assistant's comments. My understanding of what had transpired was considerably altered by seeing the old couple's actions from a different perspective. It really taught me that empathy is important. And finally, on a professional level, I'd say that, I love discovering new knowledge, organizing it, and advancing understanding through my research. Nonetheless, that gratification is truly magnified many, many times as a consequence of teaching, where I can share my excitement about science as well as my knowledge about quote unquote scientific facts and quote unquote scientific processes, and for combining them in meaningful ways to gain predictive understanding. As an educator, making a difference in the lives of our students is the most rewarding for me and the most awesome aspect of a profession.
That's a very rich experience, a very poignant moment of transformation in a person's life, it seems to me. And interestingly, much like your experience, Mike, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life happened when I also was out of my element, anchored in a distant culture and away from everything that was familiar to me. It happened during my first sabbatical. I worked in the small village of Santa Clara del Cobre in the mountains of Michoacan, Mexico, at Secate Adolfo Best Malgard School of Art and Craft, a very small school. At that time, I had the great privilege to work firsthand with the Purépecha descended coppersmiths who've been making copper vessels in Santa Clara since pre-Hispanic times. They have a 600-year-old tradition, which has nearly died out several times, but it's been revived through considerable effort from cultural entities, and it uses a technique practiced nowhere else in the world. So when I lived and worked there, the economy ranged from families living at subsistence level up to the well-heeled administrators of the Santa Clara Museum of Copper, which the small pueblo had in spite of its size, and included every level in between. But what was consistent among every family and business was their connection to the village's economy and their very proud tradition and skill of making copper vessels. This sounds a bit poetic, but each morning I woke to the musical sounds of hammers that were ringing from every corner of the village. And I should point out that hammers that strike copper vessels, or that hammers that strike steel to make tools that then make copper vessels, is not like the sound or the determined racket of a typical construction site that one might be familiar with. It's more like a sound of rare percussion instruments warming up for a symphony. It's a very different sound. And Santa Clara is very appropriately named one of the magic pueblos of Mexico, I think in large part for this sound. It was really a rare opportunity for me to be one of the first American women to work directly with the Santa Clara master artisans. At that time, which was the mid-90s, making copper vessels was still a craft tradition in Mexico defined by gender. So my coppersmithing class colleagues were all boys between the ages of 10 and 15, all of whom were exceptionally skilled and accomplished. I, on the other hand, was not. So as a beginner, these boys also became my teachers. You know, I believe I was briefly accepted into their inner circle because in exchange for this rare opportunity to learn coppersmithing from these masters, I in turn taught a class in functional mechanisms, things like hinges, clasps, and catches, to the women teachers of the school who specialized in jewelry instruction. It was a true intercultural exchange, both culturally and artistically. So for half a day, I was an expert trained university master craftsperson. And the other half, I was earnest and hardworking, but a complete blundering novice. During my months working in Santa Clara, I was humbled by this fierce commitment of the people to their life's work in spite of the hardships of manual labor, and also by their intense pride in their unique skills and accomplishments. But truth be told, in those months, I know I learned as much about myself as an artist and educator and student as I did about smithing copper. Professionally, like you, Mike, teaching has been one of the most fulfilling cornerstones of my life because of the shared environment it fosters for both challenge and creativity. Also, likewise, I'm grateful for my fellow artists and education colleagues who generously share their insight and passion and have done so over decades. It's really helped me to recognize the vital source of community and friendship, and it offers context and meaning to my life's work. I'm grateful also as well to opportunities such as Seeing Truth, and to this incredible experience of working with scholars like you, Mike, and also to be associated with Alexis Boyle, who authors this series.
I also would like to end our discussion by sincerely thanking you, Beverly, for this very engaging interchange about seeing truth from multiple perspectives, the lenses employed by artists, scientists, and for graciously opening windows for me so that I could more deeply appreciate the life of an artist. Thank you so much, Beverly. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.